thank you all for joining us today. Today I'm going to be talking to you about how to build trust in highly regulated industries. Hopefully we will learn something, but learning to trust and talking about trust is something we do far too much of. So I've decided to add a load of romantic comedies in there. Is anyone here a fan of romantic comedies? Cool. Deathly silence. Excellent. Well, this is going to be really painful half an hour. Feel free to show yourselves out. By way of a quick introduction, I'm Liam. I'm a penetration tester at KPMG. Now, you may be thinking, what do pen testers know about open source software? Well, turns out quite a lot. Most hacking tools are released for free on GitHub, and in fact, I've released many myself, and so there's a strong culture of open source. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these open source tools are, by virtue of the fact that they're released for free on GitHub, don't have any kind of vendor backing. So we, very, very early on, I mean, like before I started hacking things or pen testing things, always get permission, we had to learn how to trust open source technology. We had to learn how to verify that this random GitHub repo by somebody who you've never met before, who claims to do some kind of hack or attack, could be trusted. And when open source started to get adopted across the wider industry, specifically in highly regulated industries like the financial services, the knowledge that we'd built up from having to do this with dodgy Git repos of years gone by became really, really useful. And we've used that, hopefully, to great effect, as we'll be talking about here. And I told you, there is going to be quite a lot of romantic comedies. Trust is built over time. There is a slight, obviously, film harks back to that. And unfortunately, as much as we'd love to bring in open source technologies to kind of financial services institutions or loads of different businesses immediately and have them be adopted and have them be used, that's not quite how trust works. You don't immediately jump into a new relationship, or it's generally ill-advised if you do. And so likewise, when you're building trust in open source technologies, it's advised that you build that up over time. So you start slow, and then you slowly start to build momentum and start to incorporate this into other parts of your of your various workflows. And this is certainly true in pen testing and in the kind of hacking side of the world as well. When we were starting to bring in the tools, especially to big corporate environments like our own, we have a team of lawyers, and we had to convince a team of kind of risk experts and lawyers that they should let us install loads of hacking tools on laptops and let us run around plugging into things and generally hacking stuff, which was a very interesting conversation, but one we eventually got to do. But again, it took time. It took time to build that. And when you're applying that to your own implementation of open source in the financial services, that's the big lesson, is it's going to take quite a lot of time, and don't try and kind of shoot for the stars immediately, because that's not going to work. That's not how you convince people. The very soft sell, the slow sell, okay, well, we've done this very small change, we've implemented this tiny amount of open source software, and look, it works, and nobody got hacked, and nothing's on fire, and we're actually okay. And then before you know it, you can start to take that to its logical conclusion and kind of move forwards, implementing other starts of open source software. Now, understanding open source. So the advantages that open source software has, and something that you can start to play into when you're having these conversations internally, is that it's all there in front of you. If you want to see the source code, you want to see exactly what it's doing, you have it. And that, especially when, again, we were having those conversations with our risk teams, that comes in really, really handy. You're not trying to guess what this binary that you download from the internet is going to do when you try and run it. You know, because you can see exactly what it's doing. Now, there are some advantages and some disadvantages to that. The advantages of kind of a closed source, but one that has a kind of known brand behind it, so say Microsoft publishes a package, you can run away and blame Microsoft if it goes and hacks your system, right? They had a third-party compromise, and you downloaded that binary and ran it, and then before you know it, you've got ransomware, and you're having to pay out. You've got somebody to blame. So that's the advantage of that side. But with open source, and again, mixed bag, you don't have that. You have to have the requisite expertise either in-house or get a consultancy in to do it for you to go off and kind of validate what that code does. Or again, then you can start to build on the other people within the industry using it. So I know that this forum today is all about kind of knowledge sharing within the industry and making sure that if one company is using one piece of open source software, maybe then and they trust it and they've done their due diligence, then we can start to kind of build and trust off each other. But there is a distinct advantage to open source software, which is that you are immediately able to see what something is doing. And that, when you're having those initial conversations, can be very, very powerful, especially if you have the requisite skills in-house to go and perform that validation. Now, in regulated industries, who here works in kind of a highly regulated industry? Expecting almost every hand to go up, and it did, lovely. Right, this will make sense. How difficult is it to get people to trust things? Very? Quite difficult. Nobody trusts anything because the penalties for when you get that trust wrong are very, very high. Either your financial regulator comes after you, or your clients come after you, or the press comes after you. Somebody's normally coming after you when you've made a mistake like this. And so there's inherently a trust deficit. You're not going to trust something, and people don't want to trust things, and that's why we all have risk teams and compliance teams and armies and armies of lawyers who kind of pore over everything to make sure that when you are trusting something, it can't come back to bite you in the proverbial. Now, that then comes in, especially when you've got kind of regulations and kind of compliance issues. So GDPR or PCI DSS, these are incredibly complex challenges to navigate, much like the decision Bridget had to make. Has anyone seen Bridget Jones's diary? Okay, a few people, lovely, okay, good. Oof, I was worried that that was going to fall flat. But again, there's GDPR is the big one, or the Data Protection Act in the UK, and these are really complex challenges that you have to try and navigate, especially when you're adopting open source software, because you don't have a big vendor that's come along and said, yes, absolutely, you can trust this. This is compliant with GDPR. You have to either trust the maintainer, or you have to validate it yourself. Again, if you don't have that expertise in-house, that can be quite difficult. But once you do have that expertise in-house, then it becomes, it's then your baby, and you then own a piece of an open source project, and because you have that trust, nobody's ever going to lock you into like what Google and AWS have done recently, where they start off very, very cheap, and then you get vendor locked, and before you know it, they've tripled their prices, and you're sitting politely apologizing to your CFO why you need to triple your budget. Open source software, of course, helps to mitigate a lot of that. There is a little bit more of that upfront cost of getting that requisite expertise in, but 3 years down the line, your GitHub project's not going to suddenly decide it wants to charge you 3 times the price for exactly the same, or often a degraded service. And that is one of the complex challenges that you're having to navigate. And when you are starting to navigate that, especially with even more, GDPR, DPA, very, very serious with PCI DSS, it's even more important that you're able to navigate those challenges effectively. And doing that by leveraging open source software, again, because it's open by nature, upfront cost, but a longer term payoff. And when you're demonstrating your compliance to regulators, you have that expertise in-house. So when something does go wrong, or if it does go wrong, you can manage that internally. You're not having to say, oh, I'm really sorry, our third-party vendor, who won't tell us what exactly has gone wrong here, messed up, and now there's a load of public data online, or something like that. So I've touched upon this throughout the kind of start of this. How are we doing for time? Lovely, okay. Building trust in open source. Now, who here has leveraged open source within their organizations? 1, 2, yeah, a few people. Was it easy to get people to trust it? Was the adoption easy? Was it a bit of an uphill battle? I'm getting a very strong shake of the head from the back of the room there. So probably not very, very easy to do that. And as I was kind of been saying over the past 8 or so minutes, there is a difficulty in building that trust, but how you have that conversation and how you approach that conversation can really impact the outcome of it. Which brings us on to Notting Hill. He turns up in a lot of these. It's almost like he gets typecast for everything. Honesty and openness. As I said before, open source software embodies honesty and openness. It embodies being trusting. It's saying I'm so willing to have everybody judge me that I'm going to write all my shoddy code and upload it onto the internet. To any open source contributors in the room, sorry, your code's not that shoddy, I promise. It's not as shoddy as mine. But again, it's honest, it's open. It's by definition, you can see what it's doing. And that is an incredibly valuable tool when it comes to trust and building trust. Closed source, closed source software projects, when you use them, you don't actually know what it's doing under the hood unless somebody provides you with the source code. And open source, that's the opening gambit. It's here's all the source code, you can see exactly what it's doing. I want you to trust this because I know I've done a good job, not I'm kind of hiding behind a closed source solution. And again, leading with that in the conversations that you have when you're trying to sell open source internally can be very, very valuable. 10 things I hate about you. This is my second favorite rom-com. If you're interested, who's seen this one? Yeah, lovely. Any fans, big fans, little fans? Anyone really hate it? Excellent, great. I was going to have you thrown out if you said yes to that, so I'm glad nobody nodded. I don't think I can get anyone thrown out. Are you going to throw anyone out, mate? I don't think so. No, cool. Consistency and reliability. This is the other kind of big one with open source. Like again, open source can fail, and has failed pretty spectacularly in the past. Anyone hear of the XZ-utils compromise? Right, so that's like absolute worst case scenario, right? Somebody spends 8 years, somebody who may have been affiliated with a government body, but we won't name them here, spent 6 or 8 years, forget now, worming their way into a position of trust within an open source community, and then installed a backdoor in a very, very popular software package. And that was used as a stick to bash open source projects, right? Look what happened to XZ-utils. And now that could happen to you, or if you're adopting open source, how are you protecting against that? And whilst that's very true, it's stacking them against each other, how many times this has happened to open source projects versus private companies. There's some pretty famous examples of where private companies have been backdoored. And for the life of me, I forgot to put it in my notes, but there is the very famous hack of the worm that propagated kind of all across Europe and many, many years ago. And that, again, that was part of a third-party compromise that somebody had brought in a software package. And because third-party supply chain kind of risk management was not such a hot topic at that point, they got compromised, and then loads of their clients got compromised, and we lost loads and loads of data. And so, again, it can happen in the private sector. The difference is, of course, here, because so many people, fortunately, a Microsoft developer was, I think it was a Microsoft developer, was using this open source package and during benchmarking noticed that an SSH connection was taking half a second longer. And because of that, he went, hang on a second, I need to investigate this, and found the back door. Now, in a closed source software, I don't necessarily think that would have been as obvious or even as possible to identify, because he had obviously had the code. He could go back, look through it, identify it, and raise the alarm. So even when even when open source falls on its face, there's still those inbuilt checks and balances. And because of the openness of it, we were able to identify that and potentially manage to mitigate what could have been an incredibly dangerous vulnerability. Although noticing a half-second latency in an SSH connection, that's just levels of dedication I don't think I have. So leveraging open source. I've already asked who leverages open source in the room, so I won't ask you that again. But when you're going about using it, and we use it obviously all the time in pen testing, it's a difficult initial sell, but very worth it at the end. The proposal, again, I'm a big rom-com fan, if that wasn't immediately clear. An excellent, Ryan Reynolds is just hilarious and gorgeous, which always helps. But he he's running through the the proposal, which did in fact grow into a strong relationship at the end. There was a little bit of immigration fraud committed during the film, but we'll gloss over that and we'll move on to kind of what it turned into, which was it was in fact a strong relationship. Now, don't start your open source software run by lying to everybody, especially not immigration control. They don't like that in America, but in the end, they had this very kind of open, honest communication that they'd set up between the two characters in this, and that was the foundation that they then went on to build, as I said, that very strong relationship, and they did end up getting married if the title wasn't immediately obvious. And now, open source has been adopted in many areas. The most famous example of an open source project, of course, is Kubernetes. Which was open source now. Kubernetes initially was designed as the AWS killer, which is why it got so much investment, because AWS had cornered the cloud market. For those who don't know, apologies for those who do, I'm telling you how to suck eggs. AWS had cornered the cloud market, and all the other cloud providers went, hang on a second, how are we going to really screw AWS? Because they're taking all our money, and we all like money, so we want some of their slice of the pie. And so Kubernetes came along, and it was vendor agnostic, so you ended up having Azure could support Kubernetes, and Google Cloud could support Kubernetes. And that was how they were going to, kill the AWS monster or slay the AWS dragon. Of course, AWS then turned around and said, well, we'll just support Kubernetes as well. And anyway, it got a little bit more complicated than that. But that was the most kind of egregious example of how open source has been leveraged to incredibly great effect, even if it was cloud providers being petty with one another. And Kubernetes is used across healthcare, finance, and government. In fact, it's used in many forms across many industries. I imagine a lot of the people in the room today have been using Kubernetes or have interacted with it at some point, or during an engineering meeting, somebody said, can we deploy this on Kubernetes? And there's other examples as well. I won't bore you with the entire list, but there's more examples than that of how open source software has been leveraged in industries that are in fact highly regulated. Healthcare is an incredibly regulated industry for good reason. If you get healthcare wrong, you kill people. And so there needs to be that inherent trust not only just in the things you're doing, the medical professionals and how they're interacting with clients and patients, but also with the technology that's being deployed. I'm fortunate enough that I do a lot of security testing with some healthcare organizations. And again, the amount of compliance they have to go through to make sure that everything is completely locked down and you're not exposing patient data at all. There have been some kind of quite famous instances in the last couple of years of where that hasn't gone very well. And so there's constantly new regulation being enforced on the healthcare industry, not only in the United Kingdom but globally, just making sure that, again, patient data does not fall into the wrong hands, because it's so vitally important that nobody gets onto it. And so if healthcare can use open source software, I'm pretty sure more people in this room can as well. So tradition dictates that you buy a vendor, and this was recommended to me. I never actually got around to watching it, but I will be doing so after this talk. It was recommended to me by a colleague of mine. Apparently, judging by some of the nods, it's quite good. So I will definitely be watching this. But best practices for implementation and compliance. Again, there's still you'd normally do vendor due diligence. I'm sure everyone's done like third-party risk management, or you're onboarding a new vendor. You send them, generally it's a colossal spreadsheet of, do you do pen testing? Are you, uploading all our data to, servers in, China or Russia? And they all say no to that. Are you ISO 27001 compliant? And that is a tradition. I'm sure almost everyone in the room's done that, right? Especially when you're onboarding vendors. Well, you can do a similar thing when it comes to open source projects. Obviously, there's rarely somebody who's there to answer the spreadsheet, and most open source maintainers will use some quite colourful language if you try and send them one of those spreadsheets. But there are still things you can do, and the idea and the framework behind kind of vendor or third-party risk management can still be applied to open source technology. It's not a like-for-like comparison or like-for-like mapping between the two questions. It's unlikely that a Git repo has ISO 27001, for example, but there are equivalencies. Are there multiple reviews before a commit happens? Who is on the approved maintainers list? Can anybody launch a commit, a commit to the main branch, or what is the steps behind doing kind of push requests and pull requests, and how does that ecosystem and how is that ecosystem maintained, and how is that ecosystem interacted with? Are there one or two trusted maintainers that have to approve everything that goes into the main software product? And so there are definitely lessons you can take from traditional risk management and apply them to open source. They just look slightly different, but it's still achieving the same goal, right? It's still making sure that you ultimately trust what is being ingested into your organization, and so you can ultimately trust the product that's being deployed. Lovely. Overcoming barriers to adoption. Now, we've all done this, I'm sure. Social barriers. So requirements, and another incredible film. But the requirements of kind of regulators and the requirements, not even just external regulators, but your own risk management team, can be quite difficult to satisfy. And as I've said, kind of consistently throughout this talk, there is an inherent distrust in things that don't have a badge of approval by a known vendor. It's not something we know, so we'll always get a bit, antsy about it. And that can be very, very difficult to do. But again, as I've been touching on, there are ways to overcome those barriers. And focusing on the open nature of open source, focusing on the inherent trust of open source, using even scary stories like XEUtils as positive wins for the open source community is a very, very valuable tool for overcoming some of those social stigmas. The other argument is, again, one I've touched on previously, but their financial implications. There is a bigger upfront cost. You have to adopt the technology. You have to have the requisite experience in-house to use the technology. But the Git repo is not tripling your costs in 3 years' time because they get a new CFO in who needs to make an impact. Right? Importance of trust and collaboration. This is less of a kind of appeal to people's wallets and more appeal to people's hearts. But trust and collaboration are fundamental to open source. If you're just ingesting open source, you're never giving anything back to it. That's not really in the spirit of the community. So again, talking about pen testing or hacking, there's loads of open source tools. The famous one is a tool called NetExec, which if you've ever been the recipient of a pen test, I guarantee, especially like an internal pen test, I guarantee you the pen testers have used either that or a version of it. Its predecessor was called CrackMapExec. And that is an open source repo. Right, it's used by pen testers and it's trusted by pen testers because it's the best. It's like a Swiss Army knife for exploiting SMB and a few other Windows-based services. Now, if everybody just used the tool and nobody ever gave back to the open source community, we'd be in a bit of a pickle. Fortunately, NetExec has hundreds of contributors. There's people who are actively creating new content to push into the tool. And now there is quite a stringent security process because, again, it's a hacking tool and we need to have that trust in there. But there's loads of modules constantly being written for it and pushed into it. And because it's all out there in open source, we can verify it very, very easily. So when we're using it in our pen tests, we can download the source code, run it through our kind of security pipeline and validate that the tool that we're using on our clients is trustworthy. Because again, we can see exactly what it does, and every time it changes, we know that it's changed. It hasn't, it's not some kind of shadow patch that is downloaded overnight. We can see that the version's changed. We can see that there's been a push to the Git repo, and we can then go off and kind of deal with that as we will. There was a very famous instance, actually, of anyone here of LinPs? Linux privilege escalation kind of script. LinPs is again, it's another open source hacking tool. And it's used you run it on Linux machines, and it tells you if there's any paths to privilege escalation. So you generally, if you are assessing a system and you land on a box as a low privilege user, you'd run, this is one of the first scripts you'd run as a pen tester to check if there's any ways to escalate your privileges to like an administrator level or a root level. And linpiece has the .sh is a domain. So it's linpiece.sh, bash script. And somebody bought linpiece.sh. And they put what looked like the actual linpiece script on there. Now, they broke it in such a way that if you'd curled it and tried to run it, it would fail and you'd have to go to somewhere else. But if you browsed to the site and just hit Control-A and copied it, paste it in there, it would run what looks like quite a legitimate linpiece script output. Of course, in the background, it was logging the IP address, who you're running it as, the name of any domain if it was domain joined, and quite a lot of other sensitive information. It was being exfiltrated off to a separate source. Now, again, that's part of the trust but verify model that you need to adopt with open source. You can't have people just running off and downloading things and trying to get into, grabbing things off the internet and saying, well, it looks kind of similar, so we're just going to go and run this on people's systems, or we're going to go and deploy this in production environment. There does need to be a trust element there. Now, fortunately, that domain was actually being run by a colleague of mine who was doing a research talk, which will be presented at some conference somewhere, I'm sure. So fortunately, it wasn't malicious, but it very well could have been. And that's why the trust part of this, I've got a laser pointer and I've always wanted to use it. Right, trust part of this is so important. Told you I'd use it. Collaboration, again, also important. You need to be giving back to the community as well. And we're quite proud that we release a lot of the tools that we use on client assessments are released under the MIT or equivalent licenses on GitHub as well. Giving back is just as important as taking. The future. How are we doing for time? Oh, okay, 4 minutes. Let's run through this. La La Land. Excellent film. Emerging trends can unlock new opportunities. Again, Kubernetes is probably the perfect example of this. There was a need to rapidly scale applications. Microservices were becoming very, very popular, and Kubernetes provided the perfect estate for that. And again, if you were an early adopter of that technology, then you could grab, you could upskill your engineers in it very, very easily. And if you're running either bare metal or it's cloud agnostic, so you can kind of deploy it wherever you like, then you are able to get ahead of the curve and keep that cost down while you still had the latest and greatest in technology, and the capability to scale any application that you did build very, very, very rapidly, which again, vitally important. Finally, silver lining. The new technologies, there's a great open source tool called SteamPipe. Who here uses a cloud environment in their workplace? Excellent. Who here regularly scans it? That was less hands. There's an open source tool called SteamPipe and a kind of sister tool to it called PowerPipe. It's free online. You download it. It's trusted by pen testers and security auditors the world over. And this is like, I think the easiest step into open source tooling is you provide it with some access keys, and it goes off and like read-only access keys, so it can't make any changes. It can just read data, and you run scans against your cloud environment, and it'll do full sys benchmarking against it automatically in the background. It'll do kind of compliance checks to a variety of different standards. Again, all open source, all free, and very, very useful piece of technology. And again, I think probably the easiest gateway into open source, by open sourcing your security and your compliance, which is obviously very, very important and quite expensive, unless you use open source tools. Conclusion. Trust is all around us. It's very easy to trust things once you've started on that journey. We trust things inherently every day. You trust your car when you get into it, or at least I hope you do, unless it starts making a strange noise. You trust, trust the bus you get on, you trust the tube you get on, you trust your colleagues at work, and so on and so forth, or at least I hope you do, so on and so forth. So there is plenty of trust to go around. It's just about applying that to things that perhaps make us a little bit more nervous. Take a leap of faith. That one's very self-explanatory. I won't talk you through that slide. Trust conquers all. Trust is, again, once you trust something, once you have developed that trust, it's very, very easy to scale your business, reduce your costs, but also help your developers to then give back to an open source community, build a better community for all. So when you go home today, if any of you have any partners and they ask you, what did you learn today? You can say, well, my darling, today I learned to trust again. Thank you. Do we have time for one question, or any questions, anyone? Yes.
When an organization decides to adopt an open source technology solution, product, whatever, there are so many communities working on different projects on different solutions. So what would you recommend in terms of criteria to adopt to choose a certain package or product or solution?
I think it's a good question. Sorry, for those in the back who may not have heard that, it was how do you select, there's so many open source repositories out there, so many open source tools, how do you select which tools are most appropriate? I think it's very, very similar, kind of calling back to what I was saying earlier, it's very similar to selecting a closed source vendor. You look at what the tool does, is it satisfying what you want it to do? What's the trust like? Are your competitors in the market using it? Is there kind of widespread adoption in the industry that you're in? I think it's a standard kind of product fit question that we're all very used to answering, but I think it requires just a little bit more research from the internal company as opposed to expecting to be approached by a vendor. Awesome, thank you. Any more for any more? Silence is golden. Thank you very much for coming.